The swift motion revived Mitya. The air was fresh and cool. There were big stars shining in the sky. It was the very night, and perhaps the very hour, in which Alyosha fell on the earth and rapturously swore to love it forever and ever. Welcome to Book 8. And here we are taking a look at what happens to Dmitri in his dramatic encounter and conversion, and we're learning that the events that are happening to him are happening simultaneously with what we read about last time in Book 7 with Alyosha. So there's a lot to look at. So let's jump right in there with question 1. I had asked you about what's happening in Dmitri's mind. What's driving him? What is he trying to do? Well, there is definitely a lot happening. Dmitri, as you can see, he's taken the 3,000 rubles, remember, from Katerina. He's spent half of it to impress Grushenka, and now he wants to be able to pay back Katerina, and we go through these semi-comic, semi-tragic episodes to see how he'll do that, because he's hoping that Grushenka will have a change of heart. And I emphasize this question about what's happening in his mind because, like many of Dostoevsky's characters in his different novels, he's definitely feverish. He's in a fever. He's not always thinking rationally, although he is driven by this desire to have a new life, to impress Grushenka, although sometimes he goes off track and thinks maybe he's even going to commit suicide. So there's definitely a lot going on, but these are the definite goals that he has in mind. Now you'll notice as we review the plot in this first question, several characters, and we meet new characters in this book, they tend to refer to Dmitri as someone who is childlike. In fact, that's why the narrator calls him Mitya, just to emphasize sort of that sweet childlike nature that he has. And I think there's interesting motifs here that Dostoevsky uses so that we will never forget that Dmitri indeed had a tragic childhood. Do you remember while we're reading, there's talk about his shirt and the blood in his shirt and different things. If you remember, when he was a little child, he didn't have a clean shirt to wear. And so Dostoevsky is drawing back to some of those memories, and I think evoking some sympathy from us. Some of the characters seem to think that Dmitri is innocent and sweet. And I also think this is Dostoevsky's way of building towards the dream that Mitya is going to have of the babe. So remember, I told you all of the characters somehow are involved in a dream or a vision or some even a nightmare. For Dmitri, it's going to be a dream of the babe. And so this motif of childhood keeps coming back. And I told you, Dostoevsky is very concerned with children. And, you know, Ivan was looking at the suffering children. And with Dmitri, he has childlike nature about him. Now, he's so childlike, we could say, in a way, he's a little bit delusional, because as this book opens, we know Grushenka, she is flying off to meet the man who had seduced her and abandoned her. And Dmitri, he's clueless about all of that. Of course, he wants to see if she went to go and see his father, and Dmitri wants to build a new life with her. And then we have just these comic failures of how he is trying to build some schemes to get some money, selling some land, trying to do different things that he think will work for him. And so he's really driven by wishful thinking. We see where he begs Samsonov to accept his proposal, who is trying to trick him, sends him off to Lyagavy. Dmitri wants revenge. And then did you notice he has 3 rubles left? Some look at that as a Trinitarian image. He finds him drunk and asleep, and then he saves him from carbon monoxide poisoning. I think my favorite part is when he goes off to Madame Kolokov and asks her about securing 3,000 rubles. And did you notice they're talking to each other, but they're not talking to each other. Each person is just lost in their own thoughts. And she is going on and on about the gold mines. There are these gold mines. She thinks it's a scheme that might work for him. And I think it's interesting how Dostoevsky uses that. This idea of the gold mines is very much an idea of all of great literature, which I've mentioned to you before, and the pattern of going down, going to the underworld, going where we'd rather not go, as all the great characters of literature have done before. We are getting this sense that Dmitri is our hero in this part of the novel, and he is going to have to face his own underworld. And so while it's comic, there's a deeper meaning there. So he doesn't get the money, obviously, from her. He's at rock bottom. And so he returns to his father's house with a pestle in his hand, this sharp instrument. He passes the closed door. He goes into the garden. He looks into his father's bedroom window. And there's that fascinating passage there where we read how he is so repelled by his father's face. And he has such a desire, really, for murder, to kill his father. And so this is a big moment. But he does say, and something to think about, quote, "God was watching over me then." And that is how he refers to that moment where he would like to have some sort of revenge over his father. But who does he run into? Well, of course, it's his foster father, Grigory, who has this strange concoction of, I think, vodka and herbs that his wife had him rub himself all over with. So he's out there and he knocks him over and he leaves him for dead. Dmitri leaves him for dead, but notice throughout all of book 8, everything that he's doing, he's always thinking back to the blood and to the man who he left for dead, and it is haunting him. He is not at peace with that. And it's only then that he learns later that Grushenka has gone to chase after her Polish lover. At that point, he decides, though, he does want to see her one last time, and then he decides he's going to kill himself. And I've mentioned to you in earlier talks, the theme of suicide is a thread that runs throughout this novel. Indeed, in many of Dostoevsky's novels, he's encountering this question that is very much a question of the late 19th century. Well, he has 1,500 rubles left. And so with that, he orders supplies, he retrieves his pistols, he goes to Moscow to find her. And through all of that, through this quest, we see that he does in fact actually want to live. Why? Well, he loves Grushenka. And so that's going to keep him moving and keep him going. And so in looking at question number 1 and looking at our plot, we do meet a wider cast of characters. And I just wanted to tell you about them briefly because I think they, as I mentioned earlier, provide the backdrop for Dmitri's character development. Samsonov triggers the wild goose chase and, will trigger this erratic behavior that Dmitri has. And Dmitri lacks any self-discipline. He's kind of going wild here. We meet Perhotin, Andrei, and Fenya. And these are 3 characters who care for Dmitri and even try to protect him from other opportunistic agents. But Dmitri, he's so impulsive, he's so naive, he's so simple-hearted, and at the same time full of grandiose, half-baked schemes that he is vulnerable to being a victim of the manipulation of others. I think it's especially important to consider the character of Andrei, the driver, the peasant, who tells Dmitri that most of the people in the village view him as, quote, a hasty-tempered little child with a kind heart. And so I think that the narrator is quite sympathetic towards him. And then as this plot unfolds with these semi-comic elements and almost, a wedding, an orgy, what is it? All of this is happening. Through all of that, I think it's magnificent how Grushenka at the end is going to recognize Dmitri as her falcon. I think it's interesting how Dostoevsky will allow this very weak character to be transformed into a falcon before our eyes. And he is asking us the question, is this character going to be able to live up to all the suffering that he is called to? And so we're going to see that unfold as we continue to read the novel. So very interesting. Other things to note in this book. Did you notice what region is consistently mentioned in the background? Siberia. And, I forgot to count how many times. It's there quite a few times. Different characters bring it up. Siberia is this place of solitude where people are sent, cut off, and a time of penance and suffering. And so we can see this foreshadowing that's being built where there's this threat of Dmitri perhaps facing Siberia. And that is connected with this idea of the gold mines. One thing about the gold mines, I do think it was interesting, just kind of a side note in just reviewing the basic skeleton of the plot. When Madame Kolokov is talking about the gold mines, if you noticed, there's that word there that says enough, enough. Well, this is actually the title of a famous piece written by Turgenev. And I taught you the importance of Turgenev in that very first podcast about history. He wrote a farewell to literature in 1862. And like most artists, his farewell kept on going and going and going and wasn't the final farewell. And he kept on writing for 20 more years until he died in 1883. So this word enough that Dostoevsky has his character speak, it's a piece of pretentious rhetoric. It's showing Turgenev as an egotistic artist. And it's very brave of Dostoevsky to do this at this time. But why is Dostoevsky doing this? Just because he has nothing better to do but insult other writers? No. If you remember from that podcast, Turgenev, he's one of the members of the intelligentsia of Russia who are promoting a godless, pessimistic view of the world. And Dostoevsky, that's always his agenda, right? He always wants to show that this is not the kind of worldview that God is inviting us to. In fact, it's the very opposite. It comes from the demonic world. And so that is why he's doing that. And so he's really a master at taking words from other writers and putting it in there. And so all that is leading up to Madame Kolokov, who wants to send Dmitri to the gold mines of Siberia. Okay? So very interesting how he does that. Also, keep in mind other words that come up quite a bit. Is this phrase new life? We read a new life would begin at once, a new world. Dmitri talks about it, so does Grushenka. So in the middle of his childlike antics, Dmitri is authentically looking for a new life, and so is Grushenka. And we're going to see how two fallen characters are actually able to begin that journey in an authentic way. Another word that Dostoevsky likes to use quite a bit is suddenly. Suddenly stammered. This is a sign of Mitya's fevered state. So I asked you in this question, what's going on in his mind? He's not always rational. So in Russian, the way his speech is written, we have this word suddenly put in there quite a bit just to show the discontinuity of his mental process as Dostoevsky perceives it. And it's a key word of the entire novel, the word suddenly. And when I read it as a student of history, I can't help but kind of, my blood kind of gets boiling, because I start thinking, Dostoevsky didn't live to see it, but you could almost feel how he is warning us about the coming of the Russian Revolution in 1917, an event that we still have not recovered from as in Western civilization. So you really feel that suddenly, and how those dramatic things happen. I think he does that in an amazing way. So moving on then to number 2, I mentioned to you that Dmitri, obviously, he wants to make a play for Grushenka. And the way I phrase the question is, what is his longing for Grushenka like? Is it just the type of desire that leads downward? Is it just a type of lust that animals experience? Or is it connected to his dignity as a human being? And I'm hoping that you're seeing in this novel that Dostoevsky is painting that attraction for Grushenka in an ascending pattern. It is actually lifting Dmitri up. So let's look at that in some more detail. If you remember earlier, back in our earlier books, do you remember how Dmitri, we would say mistakenly, defined the human heart? If you remember, he put the ideal of the Madonna against the ideal of Sodom and Gomorrah, and never the twain shall meet. And I think throughout this novel, Dostoevsky is saying, hold on a second, that is not exactly true. Well, we're seeing that Dmitri is in the middle of this conflict between the two, but definitely, despite his tumultuous passion for Grushenka, and despite his pagan vices, the ideal of the Madonna, the ideal of the all-merciful Mother of God, again, remember that icon, she has such tremendous power over Dmitri and over the human heart. And it's really her maternal intercession that will keep him from doing things that he's afraid of doing. So this ideal of the Madonna is this ideal that is affecting his feelings for Grushenka, because he is moving out of Eros towards agape in his feelings for her. And they're both going to rise above just the sensual level. In fact, we read in this book that Mitya loves Grushenka not merely, quote, for the curve of her body. So that's a phrase that comes up in the novel, the curve of her body. Not just for that, but he says it's for something far higher. So the characters are always looking for something higher. And here, Dmitri has in fact grabbed hold of it. And so now her curves, so to speak, become an aesthetic ideal. They become more than just basic animal attraction. And that's where, moving on to question 3, that's where we can see actually both Dmitri and Grushenka are actually traveling on parallel roads. They absolutely are, because back in book 7, we saw how Grushenka was a woman bent on seduction who overcame that and then ends up telling the parable of the onion, which is indeed her own story, and how Dostoevsky would like for that to be the way that we remember Grushenka. And in the last book, if you remember, Grushenka was wrestling with forgiveness. Should she forgive the Polish officer? And if you remember, Alyosha told her she already has. And I think here in this book, when we get to that scene, I think it's very touching. When she is with the Polish officer, she is confronting her demons. Because did you notice the questions that she asks? She even begins to wonder, what was I doing for these last 5 years? And did I even love him? Or was I just loving, my own anger? And I think it's very mature of her at a young age to be willing to dissect, let's say, her love for this officer and try to find out what was really going on. And willing to allow that love to be purified and willing to avoid retaliation. And that's quite heroic. I think that as far as Dmitri and his road of repentance, I think in book 8, things turn. We really see that turn. Did you notice? It's just a masterpiece. When he has this conversation in the carriage ride with the peasant Andrei, I would recommend you go and read that again, because that is a conversation where Dostoevsky introduces hope into this dismal atmosphere. In that ride, Mitya expresses anxiety about Grushenka and her former lover. What's going to happen? What is he going to do? If you notice, it's fascinating, the peasant Andrei, he's actually playing the role of the confessor. Now, who normally does that? It's usually Alyosha, right? Dostoevsky loves to do this, where characters can see in another character a Christ-like figure where they can confess their sins. It's not in a sacramental confession, but it's an echo of that, and it's opening up to that thought. And so in that conversation, Andrei, I think, reflects back and reinforces to Dmitri his best sentiments with some prudent peasant wisdom. And he actually ends up echoing the sentiments of the elder. So let's look at that a little more closely. In the conversation with Andrei, it's interesting. There's a discussion about what a man is or a creature. He says, take a horse, for instance. For some folks, even among us drivers, drive anyhow. Nothing will restrain them. They just force it along. This idea of forcing the horse. And then Dmitri says, to hell. And then there's just this interesting meditation on hell. And Dostoevsky's putting that question out there. What's going to happen to Mitya if he takes his own life? Is he going to end up in hell? Is his soul in danger? And so this is in the background of Dmitri's mind, and he's wondering about that. And if you read this conversation carefully, he does enter into authentic prayer. Now, it's a fevered prayer, but he actually says, Lord, even if I ended up in hell, I will still praise you and still love you. So he's moving from his temptations into agony, into real life prayer. And Dostoevsky wants to show us that God hears that prayer and is with him in this mess of a situation. And the peasant tells him, you're so good that he says, God will forgive you for your kind heart. And I think this is so interesting. He says, and you, do you forgive me, Andrei? And he says, what should I forgive you for, sir? You've never done me any harm. No, for everyone. For everyone. You here alone on the road, will you forgive me for everyone? Speak, simple peasant heart. Here is Dostoevsky right here in a kernel. He is echoing the words of the elder who says, we have to take responsibility for all. We have to forgive all. But who has this wisdom? Have you noticed? It's not the educated. It's not the intelligentsia. Certainly not Turgenev. It is the simple peasant. And Dostoevsky, even though he's not naive, he does have quite a bit of faith in Russian peasantry. So the way Dostoevsky arranges this dialogue in the carriage ride, he is replicating the elder's thoughts about life through these characters. It is a masterpiece how he does that. And if you keep reading, the peasant reminds Mitya that he has the divine gift of freedom, that he doesn't have to take his own life because he is a free agent, and Christ came for all. And so he's reminding Mitya, Christ came for you too. So they're mutually reinforcing the truths of Christianity in their exchange. And so in his masterful way, Dostoevsky has turned the carriage ride into a confessional, reminding us how God is with us everywhere. So Mitya arrives at the scene praying fervently for God's forgiveness and for the strength to respect Grushenka's freedom. He's being transformed in this novel from just a jealous, prideful, let's say, client of Grushenka to someone who's coming to respect her freedom. It's a big turnaround. He wants to move towards releasing her honorably, if indeed she wants to spend her life with her former Polish boyfriend. His prayer, Dmitri's prayer, prepares him for this ironic reversal that's going to occur and the unexpected grace that he will receive. What's the unexpected grace? Well, the joy of her love, because she in fact reciprocates his love. And then at the end of the book, it is this suspenseful moment. It's purgative, right? Because he's being interrogated. But that prayer prepares him for that as well. So I just love how Dostoevsky shows the beauty of prayer. A prayer prayed in heartfelt suspense and agony. By the end of Book 8, both Dmitri and Grushenka, they now have the same desires. They are indeed on parallel roads, and they have come to the same point, the same road, and met each other there. They mirror each other. They both want a new life. You know, my goodness, I love that part where Grushenka says, we're going to go live together, we're going to move away, and I'm going to work the earth with my hands. And that echoes Dmitri at the beginning of the novel, where he is quoting all of those poems about the earth. They both show the pagan love for the earth, but now it's being purified with its true Christian fullness. So beautiful how Dostoevsky does that. Now, as I mentioned in our opening sequence, this wild ride of Dmitri that he's having, it's happening the same time as Alyosha's wedding at Cana experience. In fact, I read to you the big stars shining in the sky. These are the same stars that Alyosha sees when Alyosha sees the joining of the finite and the infinite coming together. And isn't that what this novel is about? Showing the joining of the finite and the infinite. And it's interesting if we take a wider look for both brothers, meaning Alyosha and Dmitri. It's interesting. Grushenka is the one who, we could say, sanctifies Eros. They both are drawn to her beauty, but neither of them stop at Eros. They both move up, they ascend, and they're moving up to hope and seeing in her beauty the greater beauty of the Madonna and, of course, of Christ himself. Because if you remember back in Book 7, we read that Grushenka gave Alyosha a new and strange sensation in his heart, and it wasn't lust, it was beyond that. Now Mitya yearns for Grushenka with his whole being, but he's not jealous actually of the officer. Before, Alyosha was going to throw away his vocation as a monk, Dmitri was going to throw away his very life, but now both of them are taking a deeper look at what they're called to because of her character and her beauty at the same time. I think this is so important because it was Dostoevsky who said, beauty will save the world. And right here, he's giving us a close-up example of how that can actually happen with a real live woman who is beautiful, but we're moving beyond superficial beauty. Just like the Onion chapter, last book, I should say, book 7. Here in book 8, Grushenka's imperfect beauty mediates grace in surprising ways. And we focused last book, Dostoevsky loves that word surprise, just like suddenly, he likes those words. As we look through the encounter with Grushenka and with the Poles there, we see that Dostoevsky uses stream of consciousness techniques. And there's a lot of that going on because the characters are sleepy. Dmitri, starts talking about Siberia and plans for the future. And if you notice, Grushenka is very tired. She drank too much. And she falls asleep. And I think it's fascinating. When she falls asleep, she is dreaming about snow and glistening snow and sleigh bells. But the real bell is, of course, the bell ringing for the interrogator. It's not quite what she's dreaming about. But I love how Dostoevsky will always bring dreams and visions into his novel. And as I often remind you, Alyosha has a vision, Ivan has a nightmare, and Dmitri will have a dream. So I think it's interesting that Grushenka, a female character, she has a semi-waking dream of beauty with the snow glistening. But reality as well is there with the authorities ringing the bell. But she's important. It's important to think of her vision too, because she is an instrument of God's grace unfolding. And another example of how the infinite and the finite come together in this novel. So that leads us to question 4. Through all of this romance going on, what about Dmitri? Is he able to enter into sacrificial love? And the answer is yes. Some scholars now, there's some discussion, they point out that Dmitri confuses authentic sacrifice with just pure self-immolation. Remember, there's always that theme of laceration, where a character wants to harm themselves or cut themselves because they don't think they're worthy of God's love. That is not something Dostoevsky is exalting. And all the characters have a tendency to fall into that. Sometimes it seems like he has this self-imposed punishment for his past life. But he moves beyond that. If you pay attention, he has made the decision in Book 8 to step aside, and he will release Grushenka to her Polish lover, and he will even supply the lavish wedding feast for Grushenka. It's very important. And while this is happening, our narrator tells us that is the precise moment that Alyosha experiences his own conversion at the monastery. Isn't this beautiful? Dostoevsky is giving us an anatomy of a family's call to conversion and how the Holy Spirit is arranging it that each person in the family has to make a fateful decision all at the same moment. This is a masterpiece how he does that. And so that leads us to question 5. While Dmitri is willing to step aside and be sacrificial, at the same time, Grushenka liberates Dmitri, which of course is authentic love because they're both liberating each other. She inspires him to generosity and to trust and even to healthy penitential shame. She represents salvation to Dmitri. And what does he want to be saved from? Do you remember? It's a very important term. Disorder. He says he doesn't want this disordered life. This is very important. If you remember back in book 5, we looked at Ivan's long monologues about his dark, dreary vision of the world. And if you remember, it's centered on order. Ivan doesn't see that there's order in the world. He thinks everything is random and disordered. And he refused to believe in an ordered universe. That is his temptation. And that's, of course, because someone like him, a modern man, is looking for mathematical certainty where it is not to be found. That is the mistake of modern man, and making technology and science a god in Dostoevsky's view. So while Book 8 is really initially dominated by Dmitri's frantic and sometimes ridiculous efforts to secure the funds he needs to free himself from his enslavement to Katerina, it actually ends so beautifully with Grushenka supplying the answer. She convinces him, hey, take my money and let's restore to Katerina what belongs to her. She even tells Dmitri, no, you didn't steal it. Give it back to her. Take it from me. Why make a fuss? Now everything of mine is yours. What does money matter? And, this is liberation for Dmitri. But we go even deeper. This is moving on to question 6. Grushenka says, very important, we'll go to the young lady and we will bow down together so that she may forgive us. Now this is very significant. We return again to the motif of the bow. There are characters who misuse the bow. We looked earlier, for example, at someone like Katerina, this idea of laceration and I'm lording something over you and I'll have this false sense of humility. So the bow was a tool for manipulation, very important. But then there was the mystery of the bow, right? It was so beautiful how in the very early section, the elder bowed in front of everyone to Dmitri, and everyone wondered, why is he bowing? Well, he was bowing to him to say, you're going to suffer, and blessed are you. Very much in the motif of the Beatitudes. So the bow is being transformed, and here Grushenka is authentically saying, we're sinners, and we're going to bow, and the elders' teaching, all for all, is now unfolding amongst these characters. So this is the redemption of the vow, looking at question 6. When Grushenka confesses her love for Dmitri and how much her former lover hurt her, Dmitri now becomes her comforter and her advocate, no longer her predator. At that moment, the wedding feast for Grushenka and her old lover is unexpectedly and beautifully transformed into a feast that celebrates the love of Dmitri and Grushenka and their pledge to a better future together. So very important, this image of the wedding feast. Like the wedding feast at Cana, we're looking at this feast at Mokroe. We see that impoverished individuals who would ordinarily not be welcome in polite society are part of this feast. In fact, Dmitri's fellow villagers mock Dmitri for putting champagne, expensive wine, and fine food into the hands of grimy peasants and thieving gypsies. While this feast at Mokroe is not exactly like the Cana feast, there is a parallel structure at work. Both the feast at Cana and both this feast, even though this feast has a lack of temperance, obviously, there's some vice there, but both feasts include sinners and the poor. Both feasts are only possible because of love. And so we want to keep that in mind. Both feasts show the interconnectedness of heaven and earth, and being in touch with the other worlds emerges once again, just like it did in book 6 and just like it did in book 7. So I want to show you this theme. In book 6, we have the elder's life and his transformation and his legacy. And then in book 7, we have Alyosha's moment of temptation and conversion and the stars. And then in book 8, we have the stars once again and Dmitri's conversion in his willingness to let Grushenka go, give her a lavish feast, and the unexpected joy that she actually does love him as much as he loves her. Now, at the end of book 8, where there's delirium, there's drinking, there's feasting, there's romance, there's falling asleep, and then it builds and builds and builds. Don't forget, Dostoevsky wants to write a mystery novel also. And I think it's quite chilling when Grushenka realizes that someone is watching them and that Mitya is being questioned by the police. And if you look at book 8 carefully, there's definitely a lot of evidence mounting against Dmitri as the murderer of his father. So it's very interesting how that is unfolding, and that is how book 8 ends. It ends with, he said something more, and the prosecutor too put in something, but though Mitya heard them, he did not understand them. He stared at them all with wild eyes. What's on Mitya's mind? Well, he knows that he left Grigory for dead. That's on his mind. What's on their mind? Well, we're definitely going to see in book 9. But I wanted to end with very important phrase that Dostoevsky uses to make a point. And as always, he's going to take from the great poets of his time. Now, there actually is an allusion to a Schiller poem in this book, which I did not get to, but today I really want to focus on a Pushkin poem because I think it's very important. So I am in the chapter called Delirium, chapter 8. And this is when he is drinking. It says, he drank off another glass, and he thought it strange himself. That glass made him completely drunk. He was suddenly drunk, although till that moment he had been quite sober. He remembered that. From that moment, everything whirled about him, as though he were delirious. He walked, laughed, talked to everybody without knowing what he was doing. Only one persistent burning sensation made itself felt continually, quote, like a red hot coal in his heart, he said afterwards. I want to say that again. Like a red hot coal in his heart. He went up to her, sat beside her, gazed at her, listened to her, okay? And of course, he is thinking about what happened to Grigory. And, both the characters want to pray in the middle of all this delirium. Now, this red hot coal in his heart would make any 19th century Russian think of this poem by Pushkin called The Prophet. You might have read it before. It's a very famous poem. And I'm going to let you read the words of the prophet. As you read it, keep in mind, scholars actually use these words to refer to Dostoevsky himself, because Dostoevsky, through his novels, particularly this novel, is predicting the future. He is telling us what's in store for us if we don't turn back to God. And so it's very interesting. He puts this in the mouth of one of his characters, but really it makes us think of our beloved author. Arise, O prophet, work my will. Thou hast now perceived and heard, on land and sea thy charge fulfill, and burn man's heart with this my word.